There are men in history whose reputations survive not because the record supports them, but because they were gifted at curating it. George Brinton McClellan was one of the most accomplished self-mythologists the American military ever produced. He had the right credentials, the right appearance, the right connections, and the extraordinary capacity to explain away every failure while taking full credit for anything that resembled success. He charmed reporters, enchanted foreign military observers, and commanded the fierce devotion of an entire army. The one man he never charmed, the one man who looked at the record without the gloss of spectacle, was Abraham Lincoln. And for most of the Civil War's first 2 years, nobody believed Lincoln.
That is the story worth telling. Not just the story of McClellan's failures, which historians have documented at length, but the specific, uncomfortable story of how Lincoln diagnosed the problem with striking clarity, articulated it plainly, and was nonetheless dismissed, mocked, or ignored by the press, by the political establishment, by McClellan's senior officers, and by a substantial portion of the Northern public. Lincoln was right about McClellan from almost the beginning. He simply lacked the political space to act on what he knew. When George McClellan arrived in Washington in late July 1861, the capital was still processing the psychological shock of First Bull Run. Federal troops had fled the field in something closer to a rout than a retreat. Congressmen who had ridden out in their carriages to watch a Union victory now were tangled in the same chaotic retreat as the soldiers. The mood in Washington was of genuine panic, layered under feigned calm. Lincoln needed someone to stop the bleeding, and McClellan, 34 years old, a West Point graduate with a fine record in the Mexican War, celebrated for his success in the Western Virginia Campaign, looked exactly like the right man.
The press did the rest. Within weeks, newspapers were calling him the young Napoleon. Harper's Weekly ran engravings of him reviewing troops. The comparison to Napoleon wasn't idle flattery, it was a deliberate piece of public framing, designed to convince a rattled Northern public that the right general had arrived. McClellan, to his considerable credit, and his ultimate ruin, believed it completely. He was an organizational genius, and that much is not contested. He took the shattered wreckage of the Union Army around Washington and rebuilt it into a coherent fighting force. He drilled it relentlessly. He established supply chains, built fortifications, imposed discipline, and generated in his soldiers something the Army had lacked entirely: confidence. The men of the Army of the Potomac loved George McClellan with a devotion that bordered on religious. When he rode among them, they cheered until their throats gave out. He was their general, and they knew it, and he knew it, and Lincoln knew it too. This was part of why the problem was so difficult. Because the problem, when Lincoln first started to perceive it, was not about organizational capacity, it was about will. The autumn of 1861 deserves more careful attention than it usually gets, because it is where Lincoln's education in McClellan begins in earnest. The two men were, in almost every way, an unlikely pair. Lincoln was self-educated, physically ungainly, possessed of a humor that swung between the bawdy and the melancholy without warning. McClellan was polished, formally educated at West Point, fluent in French, trained in European military methods from an 1855 visit to observe the Crimean War. When they sat together in the White House discussing campaign strategy, McClellan had every credential that Lincoln lacked. The institutional weight of professional military expertise was entirely on McClellan's side of the table. This is part of why Lincoln's early deference was reasonable. He was learning, and McClellan was the credentialed expert in the room. But Lincoln had something McClellan did not, which was a politician's capacity to read people through their behavior rather than their explanations. A man who had spent 20 years in Illinois courtrooms and Springfield legislative halls had developed a fine-grained sense for the difference between what someone said and what they meant. He watched McClellan explain, at length and in the language of military science, why the Army could not yet move. He watched the Army grow larger, better equipped, more magnificently organized. He watched the months pass. And somewhere in that watching, he formed a judgment that he would never quite dislodge. What Lincoln articulated about McClellan, carefully over time, was essentially an argument about character translated into military terms. The problem wasn't that McClellan was wrong about tactics, though he sometimes was. The problem was that McClellan had built an identity around the idea of the perfect army, and the perfect army could never actually fight, because fighting introduced the possibility of imperfection, of defeat, of the erosion of his immaculate organizational creation. Every battle was a potential catastrophe. Every advance was a potential disaster. The safest McClellan was a McClellan with a gleaming, well-supplied, unreduced army behind him, not because unreduced armies won wars, but because unreduced armies didn't cost generals their reputations.
Lincoln was not a military man, and he said so freely. He borrowed books on military theory from the Library of Congress and read them at night. He asked questions of his generals that sometimes embarrassed them in their specificity. He was learning the war in real time, which meant that his early assessments of McClellan were tentative, framed as gentle suggestions rather than orders. But by the autumn of 1861, Lincoln was already asking the same question in different forms. When was McClellan going to fight? The army was magnificent. The army was the largest, best-equipped force ever assembled on American soil. The army was ready, at least in the eyes of nearly everyone except its commanding general. McClellan always found reasons to wait. The roads were wrong. The season was wrong. The intelligence suggested larger Confederate numbers than actually existed. Allen Pinkerton, McClellan's chief of intelligence, was feeding him wildly inflated estimates of Confederate strength, and McClellan received these estimates with something that looked less like skepticism and more like relief. He had reasons now. He could tell Lincoln that the enemy was too strong, that more time was needed, that a premature advance would be catastrophic.
Lincoln pressed gently, then less gently. At one point that fall, with the army still sitting in the Washington fortifications while the campaigning season slipped away, Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward called at McClellan's house. They were told the general was out. They waited. McClellan arrived home, was told the president was waiting, went upstairs, and went to bed. A servant informed Lincoln. Lincoln left without a word. Members of his cabinet were furious. Lincoln told them it was no time for pride. He needed McClellan's military judgment, and if humbling himself was the price, he would pay it. That moment, Lincoln waiting in a foyer while his general slept upstairs, is one of the most revealing in the entire war. He endured it. He had to. The political situation made McClellan nearly untouchable. The general had influential Democratic allies in Congress. Newspapers that opposed Lincoln's administration had already adopted McClellan as their preferred military figure. To fire McClellan without a compelling public justification would invite a political firestorm that could damage the war effort more than McClellan's delays already were. So Lincoln waited. He pressed. He suggested. He wrote letters.
The letters are worth pausing on because they record Lincoln's thinking with unusual precision. In January 1862, after months of inaction, Lincoln issued what were called the President's General War Orders, a series of directives requiring the Army to move by a specified date. McClellan ignored the first one. Lincoln then asked McClellan to explain in writing what his plan was and why his plan was superior to a more direct overland advance toward Richmond. The exchange that followed laid bare the fundamental difference between the two men. McClellan wanted to move his army by water down the Chesapeake Bay, land at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula between the York and James Rivers, and approach Richmond from the east. The plan had genuine merit. It would avoid the strong Confederate defensive positions along the direct overland route. It would leverage Union naval superiority. McClellan argued it would flank the Confederate army out of its positions and force a decisive engagement on terrain favorable to the Union. Lincoln's concern was simpler and more direct. If you move the entire army to the peninsula, what protects Washington?
McClellan assured him that the capital would be secure. Lincoln accepted the plan with reservations. He removed McClellan from overall command of all Union armies, a move that was quietly unprecedented and essentially demoted McClellan to command of the Army of the Potomac alone and let the Peninsula Campaign proceed. McClellan later characterized this as a conspiracy against him. In reality, it was the first of several moments where Lincoln's instincts about McClellan proved more accurate than the general's instincts about himself. The Peninsula Campaign of 1962 is one of the great operational might-have-beens of the Civil War. McClellan had roughly 100,000 men. He had artillery. He had supply lines that functioned. The Confederate forces opposing him were significantly smaller. At Yorktown, where a Confederate force under John Magruder used theatrical feints, marching the same troops past different positions, making noise, building fake cannon emplacements, to convince McClellan he was facing an overwhelming defensive network, McClellan halted. He brought up siege artillery. He waited a month. When the Confederates finally withdrew because even they couldn't believe he was still waiting, McClellan reported it as a strategic success. Lincoln telegraphed him, asking why the army had not simply moved around Yorktown's flanks and cut off the Confederate retreat. McClellan's response was a masterwork of professional condescension. He explained, essentially, that Lincoln did not understand military operations. He had told associates privately that Lincoln was a well-meaning baboon, that the administration was filled with incompetent politicians, that the war was being directed by fools. These weren't passing frustrations. McClellan repeated them in letters to his wife with a consistency that suggests they were his settled convictions. Lincoln, for his part, was receiving McClellan's requests for more troops with growing skepticism. Historians have noted that McClellan's troop requests during the Peninsula Campaign described a situation of constant crisis. Every engagement left him reporting that he was outnumbered, overwhelmed, fighting against impossible odds. The 7 days battles of late June 1862, in which Robert E. Lee's newly energized Army of Northern Virginia launched a series of attacks on McClellan's force, ended with the Union Army withdrawing to the James River at Harrison's Landing. McClellan reported this as a successful change of base. The men had fought well, the army was intact, but Richmond was no closer than it had been 3 months earlier. What McClellan sent Lincoln from Harrison's Landing went beyond military reporting. The Harrison's Landing letter, as it came to be known, was a document in which McClellan laid out his vision for how the war should be fought. Not primarily a military vision, but a political one. McClellan told the president that the war should not be prosecuted in a way that interfered with Southern institutions, meaning slavery. He argued against confiscation of Confederate property, against arming enslaved people, against any policy that smacked of radical abolitionism. He was telling the commander-in-chief how to conduct national policy, and he was doing it from an encampment where his campaign had just stalled completely. Lincoln read the letter without visible reaction, folded it, put it in his pocket, and left. He said nothing about it directly to McClellan, but he had already been drafting something of his own. Less than a month later, he would share the first version of the Emancipation Proclamation with his cabinet. Whatever Lincoln thought of McClellan's unsolicited political advice, the historical record suggests he found it completely unpersuasive. The army remained at Harrison's Landing through July and into August, its horses growing thin and its soldiers growing restless, while Lincoln tried to determine what to do with it. He had already appointed Henry Halleck as general-in-chief, another quiet signal that McClellan's status had diminished, and Halleck ordered the army withdrawn from the peninsula entirely. McClellan obeyed, slowly, and with maximum expressions of grievance. He argued that abandoning the peninsula was a catastrophic mistake. He may have been right about that. The problem was that the campaign was his to execute, and he had not executed it. While McClellan's army was making its slow withdrawal from the peninsula, John Pope was commanding a new Union force in Northern Virginia, and he was being systematically destroyed by Lee and Stonewall Jackson.
Second Bull Run, fought in late August 1862, was a Union catastrophe. Pope's army was shattered. Washington was again under threat, and McClellan, with his intact Army of the Potomac just miles away, did almost nothing to reinforce Pope.
This is the moment in McClellan's record that is hardest to explain away, and McClellan spent decades trying. The evidence, in his own letters, in the testimony of subordinates, in the sequence of his communications during those days, suggests that he made a calculation. If Pope was destroyed, McClellan would be vindicated. If Pope succeeded, McClellan would be marginalized. He told an aide in language so incriminating that his defenders have spent generations arguing it was taken out of context, that it would be good to let Pope get out of his own scrape. He withheld troops. He delayed the forwarding of corps that could have reached the battlefield in time. Pope lost. And then Lincoln, with the Confederate Army advancing north and Washington effectively undefended, turned to McClellan. The decision to restore McClellan to command of the Washington defenses in September 1862 is one Lincoln later said he made with his eyes open. He told his cabinet that McClellan had the slows, a phrase he had been using for months in private, that singular incapacity to move with the speed that military opportunity required. He told Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles that McClellan could not be trusted to fight. He told others that McClellan had a kind of paralysis that came over him when it was time to act. He restored him anyway, because in a crisis of that magnitude, McClellan's singular gift for restoring broken armies was worth something.
What followed was Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, and it encapsulates everything that Lincoln had been saying about McClellan with such clarity that it reads almost as a demonstration. Lee had crossed into Maryland with an army of roughly 40,000 men, exhausted from weeks of hard marching and fighting. McClellan had over 80,000 available. He had in his possession through the miraculous fortune of a Union soldier finding a lost Confederate operational order wrapped around cigars in an abandoned Confederate camp, the complete details of Lee's plan, including the fact that his army was divided and vulnerable. McClellan spent 18 hours after receiving that order before he moved, giving Lee time to begin reconcentrating. When the battle came, it was the bloodiest single day in American history. Nearly 23,000 casualties. The Union Army fought magnificently under brutal conditions, and when the fighting ended, Lee's shattered remnants stood in place on the south bank of the Antietam Creek, outnumbered roughly 2-1, so depleted that another serious Union attack would almost certainly have destroyed it. McClellan did not attack. He watched. He waited. Lee retreated into Virginia, unmolested.
Lincoln came to the Army's headquarters in early October. He asked McClellan why he had not pursued. He received a series of explanations that he later characterized with weary patience as the slows in its purest form. The horses were tired, the men needed rest, the supply situation required attention. Lincoln telegraphed from Washington, "Are you not overcautious when you assume you cannot do what the enemy is constantly doing?" Lee's half-starved, poorly shod army, he pointed out, had just marched hundreds of miles and fought a battle. McClellan's army had not moved significantly in 3 weeks. McClellan did not move. For 6 weeks after Antietam, as the leaves fell and the roads remained passable, McClellan prepared. He wrote letters detailing his requirements. He argued with Halleck. He requested more horses, more artillery, more equipment, more time. Lincoln's telegrams became shorter and more pointed. At one point, he wrote simply, "I have just read your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigue anything?"
It was a devastating question, and it was purely rhetorical. Lincoln knew what McClellan would say. McClellan would explain why the question misunderstood the situation. And so, on November 5, 1862, 2 days after midterm elections that had somewhat strengthened Democratic opposition to the administration, Lincoln relieved McClellan of command. He had wanted to do it since August. He had told people he would do it in September. He had held off partly because of the continuing military crisis, partly because of the political cost of firing the Army's most popular general before the elections, and partly because, and this is a thing Lincoln's admirers sometimes gloss over, he was not entirely wrong about his own political vulnerability. The Democratic press came down on the dismissal like a hammer. McClellan was portrayed as the greatest general America had ever produced, sacrificed to the whims of a bumbling, meddlesome politician. The Army of the Potomac went into a quiet, collective mourning. Soldiers wept openly as McClellan rode through the camps for the last time.
He never held another command. What happened next is the part of the story that tends to get lost in the immediate drama of the war. McClellan went home to New Jersey, spent 2 years preparing his defense, and in 1864 accepted the Democratic presidential nomination on a platform that called the war a failure and implicitly proposed a negotiated peace. He ran against Abraham Lincoln. He lost badly, partly because Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864 collapsed the war's a failure argument before the election even arrived. But the campaign itself was revealing. McClellan had political ambitions throughout the war. His letters make clear he was calculating the political implications of military decisions in a way that had nothing to do with winning the war and everything to do with positioning himself for national office. He wanted to be the general who ended the war on terms that preserved the South's political structure, which would make him a national reconciliator, and he clearly hoped, a president. Lincoln's approach to the war, aggressive, politically transformative, and unapologetically aimed at Confederate destruction, was not merely a military disagreement. It was a threat to McClellan's entire vision of his own future.
This context reframes what Lincoln was actually perceiving when he talked about McClellan's slows. It wasn't simply timidity, though there was timidity. It wasn't simple organizational perfectionism, though there was that too. What Lincoln was sensing, and what the historical record now supports, was a commanding general whose strategic hesitation was at least partly rooted in political calculation. An army that never quite destroyed the Confederacy was an army whose general remained indispensable. An army that fought to a compromise rather than a Union victory was an army whose general could step in as a peacemaker. This may be too cynical. McClellan was probably not consciously thinking in those terms every time he delayed a march, but the pattern was consistent enough, and his own stated views on the war's proper conduct were explicit enough that Lincoln's frustration deserves to be read as something other than a civilian's failure to understand military reality.
In the years after the war, the mythology around McClellan was constructed with considerable care. Veterans of the Army of the Potomac, men who had loved their general with genuine intensity, formed associations and wrote memoirs that portrayed him with great tenderness. The contrast with the officers who served under Grant, who tended to describe hard victories won through terrible cost, is striking. McClellan's men remembered beautiful reviews, immaculate organization, the feeling of being part of something grand. They had fewer decisive victories to remember, and they found ways to explain why. McClellan published his own memoirs in 1887, a year before his death. The book, McClellan's Own Story, is an astonishing document. In it, McClellan explained every setback, every failure to move, every missed opportunity, not as evidence of his own shortcomings, but as proof of the treachery, incompetence, or interference of others. Lincoln, Stanton, Halleck, the radical Republicans, they were, in McClellan's account, the reason the war lasted as long as it did. He returned to the Harrison's Landing letter with evident satisfaction, as though its existence proved that he had understood something Lincoln had not. He never, not once in the book's considerable length, acknowledged that perhaps Lincoln had been right about him.
Lincoln, of course, was not alive to respond. He had been dead for 22 years. But the record he left was sufficiently clear that historians who came after didn't require his voice. The telegrams were there. The letters were there. The private comments, recorded by men like John Hay and John Nicolay, were there. Lincoln had said in enough different ways and to enough different people that McClellan's problem was a failure of will, not a failure of capacity. He had been right. He had said it while McClellan still commanded, which required real political courage and cost him real political capital. The fact that he was ultimately vindicated does not make the experience of being right while nobody listened any less instructive. The specific texture of Lincoln's frustration is worth dwelling on because it was not a simple emotion. Lincoln genuinely respected McClellan's organizational gifts. He said so. He also liked McClellan personally in the early months, or at least found him professionally engaging. The contempt McClellan expressed in his private correspondence, the guerrilla remarks, the comments about Lincoln's mental fitness, the condescension toward the president's military suggestions, was not something Lincoln fully knew about at the time, though he may have suspected it. What he was responding to was not personal animosity, but professional reality. The army wasn't moving. The war wasn't being won, and the man responsible had an explanation for everything except the essential problem. There was a quality in Lincoln's correspondence during this period that historians have sometimes called political patience, but it looks more like the patience of a man who understands a situation completely and is waiting for others to catch up. He rarely argued with McClellan directly. He asked questions, he suggested, he pointed to consequences. He waited for the general to perform, and when the performance didn't come, he waited some more, because the political cost of acting was prohibitive. When he finally acted, he acted decisively and without public drama. There were no long explanations. The order was brief. McClellan was out. What makes Lincoln's handling of McClellan instructive as a study in leadership is precisely that it didn't end well in any conventional sense. Lincoln didn't get to say publicly that he had been right all along. He was assassinated before the war's consequences could be fully evaluated, before McClellan's presidential bid had receded far enough into history to look foolish in retrospect. The vindication came posthumously. It came in the form of historians like T. Harry Williams and Bruce Catton, who spent large portions of their careers working through the evidence and reaching conclusions that aligned almost precisely with Lincoln's private assessments. It came in the form of James McPherson's meticulous analysis of the Civil War record, which found McClellan's performance wanting in exactly the ways Lincoln had suggested. It came, eventually, in the form of a near consensus among serious Civil War scholars that the Army of the Potomac's greatest handicap in the first 2 years of the war was not its men, not its equipment, and not the genius of its Confederate opponents, but its commanding general's unwillingness to commit. The popular culture took much longer to adjust. For decades, the image of McClellan as a tragic figure, a great man brought low by political interference, persisted in certain quarters. The soldiers who had loved him passed that love to their children and grandchildren. Veterans' reunions kept his memory respectful. The Army of the Potomac's suffering was real, and McClellan had shared it, and that counted for something in the hearts of men who had survived it.
But historical memory is not static. Each generation asks different questions of the past, and the questions asked of McClellan in the late 20th and early 21st centuries were harder ones. What exactly was his plan at Antietam? Why, with nearly double Lee's force and a captured operational order, had he not destroyed the Confederate army?
Why had the army on the peninsula, superior in every measurable way, been marched back to its ships without taking Richmond? The answers, when examined honestly, kept returning to the same place Lincoln had been pointing all along. Perhaps the most revealing moment in the entire McClellan saga is one that rarely appears in popular accounts. In October 1962, while Lincoln was visiting the army and pressing McClellan about the pursuit that wasn't coming, a friend of Lincoln's named Ozias Hatch was with him. Walking among the Army of the Potomac's vast encampment, stretching as far as the eye could see across the Maryland hills, Lincoln swept his arm across the scene and asked Hatch what he thought it was. Hatch suggested it was the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln said no. He said it was McClellan's bodyguard. He meant it precisely as the criticism it sounds like. An army of that size, with that equipment, and those fighting men, had been transformed by McClellan into something personal, a reflection of McClellan, a monument to McClellan's organizational genius, an extension of McClellan's ambitions, rather than an instrument of national policy.
That is Lincoln's critique of McClellan distilled to its most essential form. Not a criticism of McClellan's intelligence, his organizational gifts, or even his personal courage, all of which were real. A criticism of something more fundamental, the question of what the army was for. Lincoln knew what it was for. He had spent 2 years watching McClellan behave as though the answer to that question was negotiable. It was not. When Grant finally took command of all Union armies in 1864, the contrast was immediate and unmistakable. Grant fought. He took losses that made politicians and generals used to McClellan's war wince with horror. He kept moving anyway. He told Sherman that wherever Lee went, he would follow. He didn't wait for perfect conditions, or complete intelligence, or a guarantee that the roads would cooperate. He applied the pressure that Lincoln had been asking for since the autumn of 1861, and within a year, the war was over.
None of this means Grant was a better man than McClellan in some abstract human sense. Grant had his own significant failures, but Grant's relationship to his army was entirely different. His men were not his bodyguard. They were an instrument of national will, and he used them as such, and he accepted the cost of doing so. And he won. McClellan spent the years after 1864 as a businessman, a railroad executive, and a New Jersey governor. He wrote his memoirs, he gave speeches, he lived comfortably, and died in 1885, convinced that history had treated him unjustly. He had a formidable capacity for self-belief that no accumulation of contrary evidence could fundamentally disturb. It was, in a strange way, one of his defining characteristics, the same self-belief that had made him magnificent at drilling an army, terrible at leading one into. None of this means Grant was a better man than McClellan in some abstract human sense. Lincoln never wrote an essay about McClellan. He never gave a speech explaining why his general had failed him. He had other wars to fight, and then he was killed, and the arguments were left for others. But the arguments were always there, in the telegrams, in the recorded conversations, in the careful, patient, frustrated accumulation of a president's communications with a general who wasn't listening. Somebody should have listened. The evidence that Lincoln had him figured out was available in the autumn of 1861, months before the Peninsula, years before Antietam. The political forces that made it impossible to act on that evidence were real and powerful, and in some ways beyond Lincoln's control. But the assessment was correct. The diagnosis was sound. The man who had borrowed books on military strategy from the Library of Congress and taught himself to read a battlefield map had looked at the country's most celebrated generals and seen something that the country's most celebrated generals could not see in themselves. That is not a comfortable story because it has no clean ending. Lincoln was right, and it didn't matter quickly enough, and the war lasted 4 years and cost 600,000 lives. and some portion of that cost has to be assigned to the 18 months in which the Army of the Potomac sat in magnificent readiness and did not move. History eventually caught up to Lincoln's judgment. It almost always does in the end. The problem is that the end has a way of coming too late for the people who needed the truth in the beginning. George McClellan was the wrong general for that war, at that moment, facing that enemy. Lincoln knew it. He said it out loud in one form or another more times than most people remember. He was ignored, dismissed, condescended to, and ultimately proven correct in every particular that mattered. That is a story about one general and one president during one war. It is also a story about something considerably more durable. What happens when the people who most need to hear a hard truth decide that the person telling it simply doesn't understand?
History rewards the honest reckoning over the flattering one, but it rarely does so on a convenient schedule. Lincoln's clarity about McClellan cost him politically, exhausted him personally, and forced him to watch an army he desperately needed bleed away months that could not be recovered. He bore that with remarkable steadiness, and when he finally got the general the war required, blunt, relentless, indifferent to his own reputation, the war ended. The connection between those two facts is not coincidental. It is the entire point.